I'm going to hand over to you now, Kirsten, to facilitate our discussion.
Yes, no problem. So thanks very much, Betsy. So as you can see from the screen in front here, we thought that it might be quite nice to start our discussions by just sharing a little bit about what we're engaging with at the moment. So myself, Betsy, and Susie. So I'm going to stop the slides for just now because it's a bit disembodying having just slides up in front. And we hope that this will be a way into our further group discussion after this element of the day, in terms of looking at sharing what you're looking at. So the resources, the readings, the podcasts, the videos, the things that have really resonated with you over the past academic year. And as we do this, we're just going to be looking at this idea of, why have we engaged with particular texts or particular readings? What impact is it having on us? Is it having an impact on our own professional development or the learners or colleagues that we work with? And then starting to think about, having engaged with one or more particular resources or reading, where else would we like to go in the future in terms of thematic areas or types of resource, in terms of making sure that we continue that journey. So, as I say, this is just a little bit for the next sort of 10-15 minutes of discussion between the three of us about what we're looking at. So, Susie, I'm going to come to you first, if you want to share a wee bit more about what you're currently looking at and why it resonates with you, why you chose it.
Thanks. If people have been in these sessions before, they'll know that the social justice and equity side of learning for sustainability is something that I've been really leaning into to learn a lot about in the last few years. And because I've just been out of the classroom since last August, oh my goodness, it'll almost be a whole year soon. I did see a lot in the last couple of years that issues with gender and sexuality were something that I wanted to know a lot more about so that I could support my pupils. And there was a lot of discussion about the influence of Andrew Tate, for example, and misogyny in the classroom, and lots of questions that I had in my head about how do I make sure that I'm honouring all the voices in the classroom and making sure that people are able to express themselves and that they feel safe and psychologically supported by me as a teacher, and also that if they have perhaps growing identity issues to do with gender and sexuality, that I might have a role there in helping them to feel that they can approach me if they need to speak to me about anything or speak to their guidance teacher, but also that I'm creating a safe space in my classroom. So that was something I wanted to learn more about. And one of the texts that I have been looking at, I'll post it in the chat box, is by Yvette Taylor, who is an academic at the University of Strathclyde, and she's a real lead in terms of Scottish academia on gender and sexuality, and she's written an article called Intersections of Class and Sexuality in the Classroom. So I can talk a little bit about that in due course, but I'm also interested to hear what both of you have been reading and what aspects of learning for sustainability that's covering.
Okay, over to you, Betsy. What is it that you're looking at the moment and why? What's drawn you to it?
Well, it's very interesting to hear what your focus has been on, Susie. And I guess because of what's going on in relation to learning for sustainability in Scotland at the minute, I've actually been trying to look at other countries and trying to gather resource really and inspiration from elsewhere to support this wonderful idea of a movement for change in Scotland. And as I think you all know, we are Learning for Sustainability Scotland is a United Nations recognised regional centre of expertise in education for sustainable development. So we've got this about 200 now RCEs globally that we connect with. And one person that we've connected with for quite a while, was at an RCE originally at the University of Gloucestershire, Professor Daniela Tilbury. So I'm always interested in anything that she produces. Time is short though, and also looking for things that maybe help connect the idea of a whole setting approach with much wider audiences. So when recently, and I mean it's really recently, it's last week I think, came across this blog that she had written calling Empowering Learners for a Sustainable Future, a Whole School Approach, I jumped with joy. And then she does write very, very well. And so in a very short article has really encapsulated what we're trying to do in Scotland in settings. So I guess that's where I was coming from with connecting with this particular resource. What about you, Kirsten?
So yes, I suppose as you mentioned, Betsy, we're part of a much bigger global family, our organisation, Learning for Sustainability Scotland. And one of the things that we do as an organisation is we encourage our members to set up what we call action groups on particular themes or particular aspects of learning for sustainability that they'd like to explore a little bit more. And I've been working with a couple of our members on a fledgling action group that's looking at aspects of identity and heritage, particularly with regard to Indigenous heritage and what that means, both here in Scotland and overseas, and obviously the intersections between Indigenous knowledge and ways of being and more sort of commonly understood, I suppose, Western non-traditional societies. And the reason I suppose that I'm drawn to this particular text is I've been sort of reflecting on what we don't know in terms of when it comes to sustainability. The fact that the more you find out, the more you realise just how little you do actually know about the many different cultures and traditions that underpin the wonderful human species. And the knowledges and traditions and ways of looking at the world that can really enrich my own perspective as a practitioner, my own perspective as someone who is working across the world with our fellow RCEs, but also in terms of my own practice and understanding of ecology, of sustainability, of culture, society, politics, all the things that interweave and interconnect to bring about sustainability in all its many facets. So the book I'm reading at the moment, and I've just started reading it, I'm in about chapter 3 or 4, is a book by an Indigenous First Nations academic from the United States called Robin Wall Kimmerer. The book is called Braiding Sweetgrass, and I'm just going to put a link to it in the chat. And it's a fascinating book because in it she's weaving together Indigenous heritage, her work as a scientist, and how those two worlds kind of interweave and interconnect in terms of the sort of Western discourse and the Indigenous heritage that she brings to the table. And it's a beautiful book in terms of the way it's written. It's very poetic. It's very engaging in its tone, but it does bring in this sort of scientific thread as well, which for me is something that is, as someone who's like Susie, really into reading, I can appreciate just how difficult it must be to be able to weave those two worlds together, but she does it beautifully. And you find yourself drawn into her world in terms of the myths and legends and folklore that she grew up with, but how that then interacts with the Western society that she is now part of. So it's really opened my eyes. I've learned a lot from it so far in terms of the fact that these discourses, these cultures, these mindsets can coexist, but we've lost so much in terms of the dominance of one particular mindset across the world. So part of the book, I believe, is about how can we coming back to what Susie was saying about this idea of enabling voice and presence and identity, how can we give those voices and identities platform and agency to be more prevalent, and perhaps change the narrative slightly in terms of the prevailing discourse. So that's where I'm at, and as I say, it's Alison's just posted there that there's an audio book of Braiding Sweetgrass, which is on Spotify if anyone wants to listen to it on their way home. I thoroughly recommend it. It's a beautiful read. So I suppose that we've spoken about the why and the what we're looking at, but taking the discourse a little bit further, what's been the impact on you, Susie, of the work that you're looking at the moment?
Yeah, no, good question. I think it's really helped me to kind of understand and situate my own career timeline within the history of LGBT inclusion in Scotland. And it's always an interesting one to ask, is where were you between 1988 and the year 2000 in terms of your own educational journey? Because obviously that was the years where Scotland went through Section 28, and teachers were told that they couldn't promote the teaching in any school of the acceptability of homosexuality, as they called it, as a pretended family relationship, So it's quite something to look back now and think that, well, I was in high school. I'll admit it, I was in high school and then university before that was repealed. So I never had a high school experience where people would have spoken openly about LGBT inclusion. And also, to be honest, there wasn't really a lot of discussion about gender issues either at that time. So that to me is the kind of starting point of understanding, well, what has that meant for my career as a teacher? And I think that even though we're nearly a quarter of a century later, we're still feeling that kind of shadow of Section 28. And the article really made me kind of think about, well, why is that? And I suppose it's a case of that old mantra that you can't be what you can't see. You've had a whole generation of teachers who've not been allowed to even be out about their own identities. If they'd chosen and wanted to do that, that was not something that they could do. And therefore, you also have even an older generation of teachers within the profession at the moment who have not been able to be role models for the younger generation. And it's also very similar for the pupils, that there's a huge power in pupils being able to see older role models, including teachers who are out and proud with LGBT issues and are maybe sort of able to signpost and help them in school. And that's just something that just wasn't even a possibility, back in those years. And it now is a possibility. But the article was also really interested in talking about navigating that as a teacher is still a really, really difficult space, because you're bringing together your personal life. Obviously, you're taking a massive risk if you are going to be open about your own sexuality, and also even the idea of teaching LGBT inclusion within the curriculum is something that has been really difficult for teachers over the years. It's only actually in 2021 that we've had a government-backed LGBT education curriculum programme, and I think it's really important that you have that support as a teacher from the government to say, this is in the Equality Act and this is what we want you to teach. And we've seen, certainly in England, what the result is if teachers aren't supported. I think it was back in 2019, they had a project called No Outsiders. And in Birmingham, they actually had huge protests within the community about the teaching of LGBT plus inclusion. And the government kind of had a little bit of a hands-off approach to it. And the schools themselves who'd chosen to involve themselves in the initiatives really got a lot of flack from press, head teachers ending up on BBC News defending themselves, etc. So I think teachers always feel that risk, especially of being kind of political, as if education's not a political space, but there's also that sense that you have to protect yourself and you have to be protected by the system. So it's good on one hand to see that we are starting to see that happen in Scottish education, And certainly we've made a lot of progress in that area that we haven't in other areas. I think when we had that curriculum in 2021, we were the first country in the world to actually say that we have to have LGBT inclusion as part of our curriculum, which was, it's a pretty radical step. And we've got organisations like Time for Inclusive Education that are backing that up with training and support for schools and university students. So, I do believe that whole Bell Hooks quote, wonderful Bell Hooks, saying that the classroom remains that kind of most radical space of possibility. So the work that's been done on the ground is hugely important with embedding gender and sexuality. But I think there are also still significant barriers, and that the article was particularly good at talking about some of the complexities of intersection. And it was something I'd really not fully considered before, that, as an identity, you're not solely a member of the LGBT community. You intersect with lots of other identities, such as your class and your race. And all of these can be factors in terms of what your experience is like, especially as a young person. So a lot of it comes down, I'm probably talking too much now, but a lot of it comes down to, the power that you have in society, and how much you're listened to again. So I find it a really fascinating area. I could, as you can see, talk about it for hours, but it's definitely impacted on me. And I guess the impact going forward is that my role at GTC Scotland is about educating on the professional standards and what that means, and trying to deeply understand that and help that to be embedded in the profession. So the more that I can understand what LGBT plus inclusion and what gender equality looks like, and understand the complexities of it, the more hopefully I'll be able to support the profession to embed that.
Fantastic. And it's wonderful to hear just how it's both kind of, fueled your passion for this even further, but it's also perhaps answered some questions that you might have had about this, and given you insights and perspectives that maybe you weren't clear about before. You've now seen other aspects, other facets of all of these different issues, and the fact that there's so many intersectionalities and intertwining with all these other things. So that's fantastic. Thank you. What about you, Betsy? What's been the impact of the resource and the reading that you've been looking at, this podcast?
This really has just brought to me the fact that this is something that maybe has been quite a long time coming in education more broadly, but that now it's something that really has, and largely because of learners and their recognition of the need for change, it's something that really has taken wing and is about to fly. And I've always known, having, I guess, worked for a long time in Scotland on learning for sustainability, that Scotland was ahead of the game in this, and that we have actually been talking about a whole setting approach for a long time. And this particular blog is essentially says that I think Daniela Tilbury says it's 30 years of work on this has taught us that a holistic approach is the approach. And so I think the blog itself maybe confirms and supports what I essentially had felt, and also leads to looking a bit deeper at the evidence that underpins that, which helps to make sure that actually, when we are taking this forward, we're drawing on lots of experience that's happening now across Europe, where the term learning for sustainability, which I guess we've been using for more than 10 years in Scotland, has now taken hold as well. So I mean, the paper that I've just put into the chat is something that was produced in 2022, and I had already seen that. And it's an input paper to a working group on learning for sustainability in Europe, which is resulting in a lot of research evidence from other countries. So it's really something that I'm thinking, from having read this blog, is we've got to keep an eye on this, and we can learn from others, and also they can learn from us. And we've got to make sure that we're documenting all the fantastic stuff that is going on in Scotland, and demonstrating the impact that it's having, particularly on our learners. So I guess those were the thoughts as I read it last week. I thought, yes, this is a great short article. Everybody needs to read it, but it does lead to you wanting more. And I think good bits of writing always do lead you to somewhere else. Kirsten, how about you?
Yeah, I think I'm just going to pick up on the last thing you said there, Betsy, that good bits of writing lead you somewhere else. They inspire you to want to find out more. And I think with Braiding Sweetgrass, what it's doing for me is helping me to think more broadly about so many issues beyond the issues of identity and culture and heritage, but really starting to help me dissect some of the big issues around, for example, decolonising the curriculum. And decolonising the way we look at learning for sustainability in particular. So, you know, obviously the author is a First Nations academic from the United States, and just thinking about the traditional societies and heritages here in Scotland, and the role that they played in obviously colonising and the Americas and other parts of the world, but the fact that they themselves have lost a lot of their heritage and culture through external impacts. So this sort of layers of impact, and the way in which some of this loss of identity has been almost passed on by those who already had been sort of subject to that process. The process was then enabled by those very people in other parts of the world, has really opened my eyes in terms of how the dispossessed can become the dispossessors. That, you know, this isn't something that's unique to any one particular heritage or race or society or time frame. And we're still seeing this process today, where language, culture is effectively prohibited or restricted for whatever way and in whatever way, and the impact that then has on people's sense of connection, both between themselves and their own heritage and sense of being, but also in terms of place, that sort of disconnection in terms of the areas in which we live, in terms of the societies that we engage with. So I guess reading this book has actually probably posed more questions than answers, but in a good way. It's made me think more deeply about the intersections of this and the way it's, and particularly in Scotland, the way it's led to where we are now. You know, examining the past to understand the present, and then looking at, well, how do we learn from that and then co-create a more sustainable future? I'm still looking for the answers. I don't know if that's something that can be unpicked by one person reading a book, but it's certainly helped me to I suppose, can sort of give shape to some of the ideas that I had, and perhaps encourage me to question some of those assumptions as well, that it's not a linear process, it's not even a 2D process, it's the most intricate 3D process in terms of understanding all of this, but understanding the fact that impact can be something that is reciprocal, and it's not just an us and them discussion. I think there's some really, really interesting intersections there. So